All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, welcome. We're really excited you're here. We'll give it a little bit before we get started with our panel to give everyone an opportunity to log in. Welcome. If you're just joining us, thank you so much. We are so excited you're here. I'm giving it just another minute or so before we get started so everyone has an opportunity to get logged in. Welcome. I'm giving everyone an opportunity to get logged in. I'll give it about 30 more seconds before we get started. So text your friends, tell them to jump on the call. Okay, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are going to get started. We want to honor your time. So I'm just really excited to get this webinar going. It is much anticipated, and I know the panelists are as excited as well. We just talked about it moments before we went live. So tonight is going to be a good night. So our panelists tonight are Dr. Harvey Fields, Eric Furda, and Jacques Steinberg. As Associate Dean for Student Success at Washington University in St. Louis, Dr. Harvey Fields is responsible for the creation and or oversight of programs, resources, and strategic partnerships for undergraduate academic success. Dr. Fields was a first-generation low-income and TRIO eligible student as an undergraduate at Morehouse College and the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he earned degrees in chemistry and chemical engineering. Dr. Fields earned his doctorate in chemistry at Washington University of St. Louis. Eric J. Furda is the Dean of Admissions at the University of Pennsylvania and the former Executive Director of Admissions at Columbia University. And soon, he will become a college counselor at a school in the Philadelphia area, thus completing the cycle of life in an admissions career. Jacques Steinberg is the New York Times bestselling author of The Gatekeepers and You Are an Iron Man, and is a former New York Times education journalist. He most recently served as a senior executive at Say Yes Education, a nonprofit organization that supports college access in underserved communities, and on the board of NACAC, the National Association for College Admissions Counseling. He appears periodically as a college admissions expert on NBC's Today Show. And I'm Dr. Ashley Bennett, co-leader of Accept, director of college counseling in Houston, founder and CEO of ABC College Counseling, and I'm an avid resistor. I'm serving as your moderator for this evening. Please use the chat feature to engage with us and one another. For more specific questions, please use the Q&A feature so we can be sure to see them. With that, let's get this college conversation started. So I will first pose a question to Eric and Jacques. How is the approach to the college search you suggest in your book different than typical advice you hear given?
Well, I think, and first of all, thank you, Ashley, for the introduction, and to Marie and Accept for having us here this evening. As will become evident to this audience, Eric and I have learned so much from Accept and its programming, including the Hap the Gates forum, which I attended in DC. And so we're especially pleased to be speaking with this audience tonight with so much of the philosophy of Accept sort of infused in the book. In terms of our approach, we very much wanted our new book, The College Conversation, to be a companion for parents, to be as if we and people like Dr. Fields and Marie and others who we quote in the book were right there at a parent's elbow at their kitchen table during the college process, from the earliest discussions right through to the end of the first year of college. We particularly wanted the book to be helpful to parents who had not gone through this process themselves as applicants, and also for parents who had gone through the process so long ago that they might need a refresher. And it struck us that all of those things, all of those objectives were differentiators from other books that were on the market.
I feel in so many ways, and thank you all for attending this evening, and thank you for having us. Really appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation, an extension of the college conversation. And you know, Jacques and I have worked together in different ways over the years, Dr. Bennett, and you know, thinking about how to democratize information and share knowledge. I mean, I know that I have a platform as a dean of admissions at an Ivy League school, and coming from, you know, two institutions, Columbia and the University of Pennsylvania. But it always struck me as I was talking to audiences that, as we all do in our field, right, we go out and we speak at schools and larger forums, was, you know, our impact was limited to who was sitting in those seats at that time. And we really wanted to make sure with this book, as an extension of the Choice blog that Jacques had with the New York Times, my own blog, page 217, that this was another opportunity to have a megaphone to share information that we have accumulated over the years, not only between the two of us, but from great colleagues that are on the screen tonight as well. So it's really that hope that we could be practical and help families, and that's the goal of this book.
Thank you. This next question speaks to me personally, as I have a 16-year-old who will be entering this crazy world very soon. Jacques, so you recently experienced the college admissions process as a parent. Did your kids teach you anything about this process? Did you advance as a professional? We'd love to hear more about how you experienced that.
So I appreciate the question, and it gives me a lump in my throat, frankly, as I know it does to you as well, Dr. Bennett. I have a 20-year-old and a 22-year-old. The 22-year-old just graduated from the college. The 20-year-old is halfway through. Let's hope it's halfway through. And I found it humbling to be a parent going through this process. And, you know, I'm looking at the subtitle of our book, A Practical Companion for Parents to Guide Their Children Along the Path to Higher Education. I could have used this book. One of the things that is, I hope that we accomplished is that every parent going through this process, in all seriousness, is going to make mistakes. None of us are going to be perfect. There is no perfect. We're dealing with, you know, teenage lives and brains and a process that we can partly control as outsiders, but much of it we can't control. And I made so many mistakes. And my hope is that in this book, that as a result, there are mistakes that I made that readers will not make. But I will say that I don't talk about my kids by name in the book, but Eric knows. They taught me so much about this process, and their teachings and lessons learned are infused throughout this book. If they were with us tonight, they would say, oh yeah, page 185, that's me. And I have a daughter who was a transfer student, and we quote Marie in the book as saying, transfer is not failure. It's one of the best pieces of advice about the college process that I ever got. And I got it as a parent from Marie. And there's a whole section of the book on if your child comes to you and says, you know, it's Thanksgiving or Christmas of the first year of college, I think I want to make a change. That entire section of the book, as Eric knows, was informed by my daughter and Marie and Harvey, among others.
I do have a follow-up question, and anyone, please feel free to answer. So why is it so important for parents and their children to collaborate through this process?
Dr. Fields, I think you see that play out once they're actually at college, right? I think that's a great one.
Well, thank you very much. So first of all, I do want to thank Jacques and Eric for, first of all, inviting me to contribute to their thought processes as they were preparing to write the book. That was very gracious for them to do that. It gave me a chance to think about and reflect upon what it is that I have been able to do and learn and experience myself. So I thank you for that. And I want to continue to celebrate all of the people on this webinar, because you actually are doing the grassroots work of making sure that our future gets to the places they need to get to learn what they need to learn, to be prepared for what it is that lies ahead of them. Now, having said that, it is so critically important for us to think about how all of our young people navigate what it means to go to college. And my own children, by the way, I want to make this comment. I have made just about every error that was alluded to. They didn't really talk so much about errors because it talked about the fact this is a learning process. But if there was a such thing as an error, I have probably committed about every error, but learn from that process. And that's where my answer to your question comes in. The collaborative approach allows the students to learn more about who they are. It allows them to learn more about their parents, and it also allows the parents to learn more about the students, because there are two processes that are going on, and most of the time we see it as one way. We see it as the student getting ready to leave the home to go to college. But there's also this part of the process where the parent is preparing to quote unquote set the student free, if you will, so that the student can now go to the next level of their self-efficacy, their self-determination, their self-learning, their self-realization. And that's why it's so important to collaborate, because it provides a platform within which that naturally occurring process can occur. And then hopefully what will materialize out of that is both parties, the parents and the student that is preparing to go off to college, can walk away from that with a greater appreciation for each other, for your unique identities, for what you've contributed, and for the importance of this process and why it is so important to be deliberate about how you approach it. So that's what I would state.
And while I have you, oh, go ahead, Eric.
It's kind of hard to add on to that. And so, by establishing these opportunities, some guardrails of these conversations and the collaboration early on, I think then you can realize exactly what Dr. Fields spoke about, particularly once you're on a college campus and you need to make a phone call when something may not be going the way that you hope. You already have that trust.
That's right.
And we don't use, Dr. Bennett, we barely use the word helicopter parent in the book. Maybe we use it once. I don't know that we use the term snowplow parent, because we think that the relationship between parents and students, parents and children, adults and mentors and children needs to be more nuanced than that. That you as a parent shouldn't abdicate your role in your child's college process. You have a lot of life experience. You also have skin in the game. There's a whole financial conversation that we'll talk about. On the other hand, another colleague of ours, Jennifer Delahunty from Kenyon College, edited a book with the title, "I'm Going to College, Not You," as if it were written from a student's point of view. And it's really important. Eric mentions those guardrails and guidelines. We talk early in the book about establishing those guardrails and guidelines and roles and responsibilities and do's and don'ts between parent and child early, and even committing them to writing, to making sure that everybody's held accountable.
Thank you for that. Dr. Fields, I do have a follow-up question. So word on the street is there are several degrees among your children. And so we'd like to hear, how were those conversations when you were advising or parenting your children as they went through the process?
So the conversations were, again, establishing the relationship of communication and trust. And I'd like to say that I think I started it in the earlier stages where they were younger and college wasn't the topic of conversation, where we talked about things that were going on in the home. We talked about things that were going on in their lives, where when they read books, we'd ask them questions such as, oh, what are you reading? What's the theme of it? What is it teaching you? What are you learning about that? When we would go shopping at the store and I would ask them to calculate, what am I going to have to pay at the cash register? And if I give them this amount of money, how much change will I get? And being able to get, or else having them look at certain things that we had to purchase and say, which of these do you think is the better product in terms of quality as well as price as well as value? So, having those just kind of natural conversations on a regular ongoing basis with them helped provide a natural conduit, an on-ramp to the more tough conversations about going to college. Because again, it was a different type of trust, but it began to develop trust. I want to be clear, they were listening to their college counselors and other individuals. And so it allowed them to therefore come back and ask questions about what it is that they were saying, being told, and what I was saying, but it allowed those on-ramps to occur. Having said that, the conversations, I'm sorry, it also helped that I went back to school to get my PhD while they were at an age when they were beginning to understand about education beyond secondary school. And so they saw me now, and they would sometimes spend time with me on the campus because they would be in the library doing their homework while I'm doing what I got to do in the lab and those types of things. So those natural opportunities to have that kind of experience, I just want to make sure I point out, gave them some time to reflect. That was different. Having said that, the conversations followed much of the patterns that are laid out in the book. I did not have the discipline to sit down and write things out in lists or to put things on index cards. And as I read the book, I appreciated the deliberateness of the approach. And if you were to tell me what one of the things you learned from the book, I would talk about the deliberateness of the planning and the roadmap that is laid out in the book. I think that is so critically important. Many of the conversations they happen by happenstance, but even though it was by happenstance, talking about what it is that they were interested in, talking about what it is that excited them. I had one of my children, when I brought them to campus, one of them would sit outside all day long, literally all day long, and just spend time drawing a tree. Well, I knew that child was different than the one who always wanted to find out where I was and engage me in some kind of a conversation about something. They were different. And so they each, by learning that, allowed me to now be able to give them information and feedback, and also allowed me to get them input. When one child told me they wanted to be, in a particular profession, I was able to get feedback and say, you could do anything you want to do. I can see you doing that. You have the talents, gifts, the skills, intelligence to do that. But if I look at where you naturally spend your time, if I look at what seems to excite you, if I look at what you choose to do when you have a choice, unless you're going to make some changes in those things, I don't see you being excited about that particular area. And while, that did cause the child to think I didn't believe in them, ironically, they ended up getting their MFA in that area, So my oldest has a bachelor's and a master's and a PhD in clinical psychology. My oldest daughter is my son. My oldest daughter is a bachelor's and a master's, and then she got a PhD. She just defended this past August in sociology and is now in a postdoc. And my youngest daughter got a bachelor's, and then she got an MFA in New York, and then she went across the country to LA and got another master's in art management. She's now working, in fact, at the Otis School of the Art, out in Los Angeles. So they each have found their own pathways. None of them did STEM like their dad did, but they each found their own pathways, and they have been very pleased with what it is they've done. And I've been very proud that they found their own pathway and did not feel obligated to do that, what it is that they saw their father did. One of them went to an Ivy League school, a traditional Ivy League. My son, Jordan, went to Dartmouth. Then he got his PhD at Memphis. One of them went to WashU and then got her PhD in Pittsburgh. And then one of them went to Spelman, HBCU, and then got her master's in New York Academy of Art, and then the second master's in Claremont out in California. So 10 degrees amongst those, my biological kids, but those conversations occurred, and they allowed me to be more comfortable trusting their choices, and for them to be more comfortable knowing that I trusted them in making their choices.
Absolutely. I'm taking notes because I'm trying to not be that helicopter snowplow, but it is tough considering what I have dedicated my life to. Excuse me. So Eric and Jacques, as you discuss in the book, prospective students forget that they are evaluating the colleges just as much as the colleges are evaluating them. So could you please elaborate on that?
Certainly. A colleague of ours, who I also have a radio show with on Sirius XM, Eileen Cunningham-Fiken, she's the Dean of College Counseling at the Dwight Englewood School. I attribute this to her. I believe I heard it from her first, where she says that, basically colleges earn their way onto a child's list. It's like, why should that college be on my list versus, you know, the way other people usually think about it and most people approach this process. And so one of the framings that Jacques and I share is that for many of the conversations that are taking place, and we have 5 of them framed out in the book, with the exception of when the admission office is making a decision as part of the conversation about decisions, the decisions that colleges are making, the rest of the decisions are being made by families, by students, with input from their college counselors and mentors and other educators. And so one of the ways that we try to frame this out is that when you're looking at any number of colleges, virtually, in person, you have to have some type of framework to compare them. And this is where we have the 4 C's. I'll cover a couple of them, Jacques, how about that? And then we'll add the 5th C, is when you're thinking about looking at schools, you want to get to know the culture of an institution. You know, what is its founding like? We mentioned HBCUs. It's, you know, what's the mission of the institution? Maybe this gets into some of the spirit of the institution, maybe some of the founding principles of an institution, and how are they relevant today? It's not just a quaint history lesson. But then also we talk about curriculum in the 4 C's. And this is basically the academic strategic plan. And I love what Dr. Fields was saying about the different paths that his children have taken. You know, the MFA degree looks different than, you know, another degree, even having 2 master's degrees, one in management, the other in, you know, kind of the fine arts aspect of it. They're different. They're both master's degrees, but the strategic plan, the academic strategic plan is different. And so we really try to bring students and families through taking really a critical eye at colleges and universities, because usually, you know what, just a few weeks ago, US News World report comes out and you're saying to yourself, okay, here are the colleges. Well, no, not really. And we want you to think critically about them and why they should earn a way onto your list. Jacques, would you like to pick up a couple of the other C's?
Sure. So I just want to say as context, Dr. Bennett, that I first met both Eric Furda and Dr. Fields in my capacity as a journalist at the New York Times. And one of my roles as I saw them there was as a translator, as somebody who could break down this process, make it accessible for audiences that were not in our world, that were not admissions officers as college counselors. And so I would draw on Eric and Dr. Fields as sources to help me break it down and explain it. And one of the things I love about both of them is that they make these things simple, they demystify, they democratize, but they don't oversimplify. And I found that framing, which was something Eric's 4 C's, something that he sort of brought to the college conversation to be immensely helpful. And so we've talked about culture and curriculum. The 2 other C's are community and conclusions. And community, what is it like to be in that community? And it requires some due diligence. When you talk about sizing up colleges, Dr. Bennett, we want students and parents to be investigative reporters, to do their homework, to be researchers. Hey, that school may say that they're inclusive and maybe even their data is persuasive, but how inclusive really is that community? How accepting of it? You know, you have to do some homework on that. In terms of conclusions, what happens at the end? Do students graduate? And after taking so long, what percentage of them do? How many go on to grad school? And in what disciplines? What jobs do they go on to? Do they get jobs? And so we think this is a framing it's a little bit more nuanced, quite a bit more nuanced than using a ranking. It's really trying to look at attributes. And then the 5th C, which we think is so important that it deserves its own sort of standing, is cost. And what Dr. Fields talked about, helping his children learn at an early age, what do things cost, how much value, what are you getting for that money? We think that this is a really important conversation to have upfront with your child. How much have you as a parent saved for higher ed? How much are you willing to spend? How much do you earn? What do these institutions cost? What's the difference between an in-state public and a private that has merit aid and a private that doesn't have merit aid? And just so that everybody's expectations are managed at the beginning. Eric or Dr. Fields, is there anything else you would add about the 5th C of cost?
Well, one thing I do want to say, and before I talk about the 5th C of cost, is I will say that the book does, again, a beautiful job of laying out this whole pathway and laying out the questions you want out to ask and how to ask those questions. And I think it's critically important for parents to realize that, and for students to realize that this really does, and this really is, does take effort, and it takes intentionality, and that it is going to take time. And that's why they need to plan. I like the way you built in how they need to take breaks, how they need to give each other space to kind of reflect upon and deal with, what the thoughts and the emotions that may be coming out, to realize this is an emotional process as well. This is not just some static, here's the academic institution you're going to go to, they're giving you the amount of money you want, and that's a done deal. So I kind of really think those are all critical. But the other aspect of cost has to do with an institution may do the best it can in terms of meeting what's referred to as your financial need relative to tuition, room and board, and the prototypical college fees. But there are other costs associated with college that may vary from institution to institution, but that are a part of what's considered the traditional or prototypical college experience. At some academic institutions, it is very common for certain classes to take certain types of trips, for example, and those things are costs that go above and beyond tuition, room, and board. And there are some institutions where goggles and a lab coat for a lab that you may take is not included in the fact that you've now paid the tuition to attend the school, you've enrolled in the course, there's an additional fee there. There are certain classes where specialized software has to be obtained in order to do problem sets. And that specialized software is not provided by the faculty member teaching the class or by the department that offers the class, or even by the school the department may be located in. So those are additional cost factors that need to be taken into account. And while it is a little bit more opaque for parents to investigate those, when you start looking at institutions and you see that the institution acknowledges that some of those exist and makes some information available as to how they navigate those things, that lets you know a little bit more about where the institution stands in terms of costs and how they try to help make this a more equitable experience for all of the students.
That's really so important what you just added, Dr. Fields. And it's amazing that some institutions have been ahead of the game in this, and others are, just recognizing those pieces that are not caught as part of the traditional term bill, but are real costs. And particularly the one, as you said, about like access codes, that accompany the already expensive textbook. It's absolutely amazing how much those could add up. And for the audience tonight to be aware of them. And Jacques, I'm already seeing kind of a blog supplement, because I'm not even quite sure we've quite touched on that. I think it's really important, the point that Dr. Fields makes.
Thank you, gentlemen. I will go ahead and voice over some questions from the chat. We have some really good ones. So I'll start with Jessica Sweedler. She wants to know, what's the number one thing parents and their children do not see eye to eye during the college search process?
I think you've stumped the band a little bit on that one. Dr. Fields and Eric, you want to take the first stab, or?
So I'll start with talking about my experience, and I will say I also, when I have time, I will sometimes engage in offering ACT prep classes. So there are people who know me, it's kind of like a word of mouth thing, and they'll sometimes twist my arm and get me to do a class. And so I sometimes get involved in those conversations with other families as well. And the number one thing they don't see eye to eye on, I think, is the student's perception of their capability versus, and therefore what school they think that they're qualified for, compared to how the parents see that. Sometimes the students' perspective is higher than the parents, sometimes it's lower than the parents, but they don't always see eye to eye on that. And I recently had the experience of talking to a parent whose child decided on a particular academic institution to attend. And that parent had really wanted their child to go to a different type of academic institution. And that parent made it very clear that they would have preferred their child to go to that other academic institution. And they got admitted to both institutions, but, you know, and it kind of created some tension, if you will, because it did not validate the choice of the student. And both institutions were fine institutions. The child would do well at both institutions. The child would have a great education at both institutions and would have great outcomes at both institutions. But now there was this dynamic that was occurring that could impact them a little bit further down the road in terms of how do they reconcile that? How do they get past that? So I would say not seeing this and not necessarily, it's not even a conscious disagreement, just not seeing the same about capabilities. And yes, it is the parents. Jacques, you said it so well, and Eric, you hinted at it as well. It is important for the parent to be that advocate, that mentor, that guide for the student, but also, as your book emphasizes, give them a chance to catch up to where you are, but also give yourself a chance to catch up to where they are, and let the reconciliation between those two things be what ultimately drives the process, not forcing it to be one way or the other.
So I have a more logistical point than Dr. Fields' higher level point. I think one area where some parents and some students don't see eye to eye is time management. If you've got 8 to 10 applications that are due, perhaps the lion's share are due on or around January 1st, but perhaps some due in the lead up to that, but most of them are at the end. Some students are not going to be able to pace themselves to make sure that they space out the why our school essay for 8 to 10 schools over the course of the better part of those months, and leave time for feedback from an adult or a peer or what have you. And sometimes that not seeing eye to eye is done, not so much with that it's done with good intent on the student's part. We talk a bit in the book about the teenage brain, and that for some teenagers, executive function is not quite fully in place. We talk about a book called The Stressed Years of Our Lives by Anthony Rothstein, who's a clinician at the University of Pennsylvania. So yet again, as Dr. Fields says, a point of tension, a point of frustration, but our hope is that working together with ground rules and guidelines, that parents and children can have a forum for sort of spacing things out and leaving time for things and leaving time to breathe. And this is another one of those cases where you as a parent hopefully can bring some life and adult experience to the idea of staggering deadlines, for example.
Well, and I absolutely love this concept of alignment. We talk a lot about alignment in the book, and Dr. Fields, I feel like that's what you were touching on as we're going like this. It's the first exercise in the book that we have just over a dozen activities in the book. The first one, and thank you for this question, is to try to take that off the table, because we have family members and the student get an index card of any size and write down what the attributes are of the college experience or the college environment, the characteristics, attributes, qualities, however you want to try to frame this, and write down 5 or 6 words or 5 or 6 thoughts, and do that separately, one side of the room and the other side of the room. And then the point of this is to then come together to see, as Dr. Fields said, is like, how much are we like this? And, where do we connect in? Where are some of our ideas complementary? Where are they just completely not aligned? And that's not to try to solution them at that point. It's activity 1 of the book. It's in the first section. However, to use that as a starting place for the conversation so that you can then start building trust again, as I said earlier, and recognize where you're each coming from, and perhaps other voices that are in the conversation too. College counselor, a grandparent, a mentor, anyone who's giving input into this process for a young person.
Thank you. I will list Lloyd's question from the chat. So Lloyd says, collaboration between senior parents gives both parties an equal stake in the decision-making process. On one level, it prevents one from pointing a finger at the other and blaming them for what may not be going quite right. I always say it's a mutual decision. We are in this together. I will also like to add Sheldon. Sheldon has a question. So how will COVID alter the standard search for a school? How would you answer the question, why pay such huge sums of money for a watered down experience?
Yeah, I'll take that on. And I think there's really, two questions that we could parse out, across the three of us. One is, so what's different, either from the college search or how applications are going to be evaluated? And then I think the larger question about investment, Dr. Fields spoke about value before. We talk about outcomes, conclusions, and, I don't want to get too kind of philosophical about this, but in some ways, what we're really talking about is credentialing, learning and credentialing, and what does that look like in 2020 and beyond? And, here we are having our, Zoom webinar, and this is the way classes are being conducted right now. And so we're not having some of the interactions that we would otherwise, and I'm not defending the cost or the price tag on this at all. While, what can we gain from this type of platform? Dr. Fields, could you have earned your PhD in chemistry in this manner? I'm sure there were many late nights where you just didn't want to turn on a computer, but there was a classmate right down the hallway that you were able to turn to. So I know I'm covering a couple different things. I mean, obviously for the fundamental changes this year, the ability to visit campuses, the opportunity to maybe take a school off your list, because once you visited, it wasn't quite that glossy brochure that you thought it was going to be. Many schools we talk about are test optional and have been test optional for 50 years, but many other institutions are test optional. So how will applications be evaluated? We could perhaps discuss that as well. But I really appreciate the second half of that question, and that is, what is the value of an education? What does learning look like? What credentials are recognized in the marketplace? Could Dr. Fields get a PhD if he didn't have the bachelor's degree and the master's degree? Is there a different pathway to that highest degree? And I think that may be where the shakeup really takes place. And Jacques and I talk about the on-college movement as well. Why go to college in the first place? It's one of the first questions we ask in the book.
And I think that, look, for those on the call who are the parents of high school seniors, or perhaps high school seniors themselves, or the counselors working with high school seniors, there's no way to sugarcoat it. This is not one of the silver linings of the pandemic, as they talk about. It's harder this year. It requires more due diligence. It requires more of an open mind. It requires more leaps of faith in terms of things you can glean online, maybe, versus being able to be at that institution. On the other hand, the philosophy of the book, and we do talk a bit about the pandemic, is that this conversation, these conversations, this process is still doable amid a pandemic. And that it's still it's still possible for young people to find higher ed opportunities that are aligned and also affordable, but it's going to take a little more work. And one thing that families can do as they do their due diligence is ask the question of whether is a school reducing its tuition as a result of learning going online. Some schools are doing that, other schools are not. What about the possibility of being admitted and putting off that matriculation, the enrollment for a year using a gap year? Strategies like that, it seems to me, Dr. Bennett, could speak to some of the elements of the question, including the value proposition.
And I'll just speak a little bit. The book, The College Conversation, is more about the admissions and transition side, but I work primarily on the operations side. So speaking from the operations side, I do know that some of the things that are going to be the same is the sense of wonder and energy and excitement, anticipation that occurs when one starts college. And yes, there's going to be a difference in the types of connectivity and the types of spontaneous interactions that can occur. There are people that are even right now developing different types of software that can simulate the water cooler talks and those kinds of things because they understand the need for that. But the value of the education is not limited to the fact that one is always physically in the spaces are always in the physical classrooms, are always sitting next to a physical body. It is also the ethos, the culture, the preparations that is being embedded into the student that is there. Because the connections that can occur, frankly, even before the pandemic, there was an increasing turn towards virtual type interactions to give students greater access to mentors, to alums, to job opportunities, to interviews, et cetera. So one thing we will need to do is really realize that while the pandemic, as Jacques says, we should not and will not sugarcoat this, it is definitely impacting the experience and the quality of experience in terms of what we are used to. But when we are now faced with this challenge, we can adapt and adjust and still maintain a way to get quality out of it, a different kind of quality, and a quality that can be as good, if not even, maybe, dare I say it, better than what we had before, because we've had to work harder to learn how to elucidate that quality out of the current experience. So I would say, if you go into it with the mindset that it's a lesser experience, you might cause yourself to not take advantage of everything that is available. If you go into it with that still wonder, excitement, and then a desire for creativity to see how can I now maximize it in the current state, I think you'll find some amazing ways to do that.
Also, in the college conversation, we preach the long view. You're looking 3-4 years into the future. And I hope that the audience won't consider it naive or Pollyannish to say that I do believe that this period, this too shall pass. We've got a long road ahead of us. Is it going to be, a road of several years before higher ed on campus returns to normal? I'm not sure it is going to take that long. And so perhaps, trying to, for parents of seniors on the call or seniors, you've got that next year to look at, which is in all likelihood going to be not quite as it was. But for parents of juniors and sophomores and freshmen in high school, pushing that long view out into the future, 3, 4, 5 years, it could look very, very different than it does this year.
I'd like to stretch that question a little bit further. So I'm sure we've all seen the data that suggests that Black and Brown students are disproportionately affected by COVID. Is there any conversation going on at the collegiate level about that and how to better serve BIPOC students in these challenging times?
I most certainly, everything's become so exacerbated over the last, half year plus. And what really the half year plus has brought out are issues and challenges that have been faced for decades and centuries, really splitting some of these pieces open. And so I do feel that what's going to emerge is an even stronger opportunity to support students who have been historically underserved on our campuses. And having that dialogue now, very painful dialogue in many ways, is going to, like the pandemic, it's going to take a few years, but when we come out of this much stronger, while also, I'm fortunate to work at an institution that does have resources, and meeting students right from the beginning in March when individuals needed to get home, or increasing financial aid and job loss, and really investing in our current students, some populations, Black and Brown, as you said, that are particularly impacted, and our first generation students. So, it's great when you work at an institution that has those resources, while we're also seeing places that just don't have those resources, not only at the college level, but in K through 12.
Right.
So that's the other piece, that although we're talking about higher education tonight, it's what supports are needed from the earliest levels of education, pre-K through 12.
I am very optimistic. I think I'm just an optimistic person, and I liked the fact that Jacques said we don't want to be Pollyannish about it. But so this past summer, we ran a summer research program. One of my responsibilities is I oversee a grant program that provides STEM support for the STEM attainment of students from underrepresented groups. And because for safety purposes, we were we knew we couldn't have the traditional residential in-person summer experience for students doing research. And we're one of two of the campuses in this particular alliance that offers that to students in this 9 institution member alliance. And so we decided to have a meeting, the two R1 institutions that provide these experiences, says, let's find a way to make sure these students don't lose out on this opportunity to have this STEM enrichment experience. And so we came together and developed a summer research experience using Teams and Canvas and Zoom, and getting faculty from both institutions involved, librarians, graduate students, et cetera. And not only did we end up, and concerned about Zoom fatigue, but not only did we run the summer research program that had them online for, 7 to 8 hours a day, we did several focus groups during the course of the summer. And at the end of it, they suggested that we continue to replicate that kind of an experience, not to do it exclusively, to have some of the traditional in-person type research experiences. So we would do that, but they talked about how they were able to connect with students from the other institutions, to connect with faculty from other institutions, to interact in different ways. And they had a little bit more freedom to design what their research topic was going to be and work on it in groups and come up with some ideas that were very novel, including some of which some of our faculty said, these ideas that we want to work on in our own labs. So, so it gave us, the challenge gave us an opportunity to say what can be done. And in doing so, created something that the students gave us feedback on and said, this was a good thing, continue to think about doing things like this going forward. So I think there's a world of opportunity out there that we will learn from, and therefore more such opportunities in general will be developed, and particularly for ways to better support and improve outcomes for students from underrepresented backgrounds, particularly Black and Brown students.
Yeah, I think one further thought, Dr. Bennett, is that one of the many ways that this pandemic has disproportionately affected Black and Brown families and families from low-income backgrounds is job loss. If you look at the job loss statistics, unemployment has disproportionately, underemployment has fallen on those families, and it becomes sort of a domino effect where, as a result of that, students who are in college, whose parents lose jobs as a result of the pandemic, may have to appeal for additional financial aid. Some institutions are able to meet that demand. Some institutions have increased their budgets quite a bit. And I'm confident that the University of Pennsylvania, where Eric works, and WashU, where Harvey works, my thesis is that both have sort of stepped up and increased their financial aid budgets. But other schools have not been able to do so. Indeed, some are on the brink of closing as a result of the financial pressures that the pandemic has put on them. So when we come back to our 5th C, cost, families listening to our conversation tonight have to ask that question of institutions that their students or their children are interested in. To what extent has the pandemic affected financial aid resources, and could that potentially affect the assembly of a family's college list? Eric, to put you on the spot, how has University of Pennsylvania responded in terms of financial aid for families disproportionately affected by the pandemic?
Well, it really started with our current students and helping them get home in March. Let's put it that way. I mean, real logistics. Students who really, that even within the pandemic, that being, I'm looking out the window right now because I'm in Philadelphia, being on our campus was a more stable environment for them. So some students haven't left since March. They've been in our college houses and making sure that they have a roof over their head and food, and real issues like that. And then I won't keep going through it, but summer earnings expectations. Financial aid packages were put together with the assumption that students will earn some money over the summer. And certainly with high unemployment, a 17-year-old isn't going to get that summer job. And so taking summer earnings expectations out of the financial aid packages and putting that into grant. And then, maybe taking it just one beat further, taking a look at what would be charged. Certainly when students aren't here, there's no room and board, but then also reducing some of the fees and reducing that amount that was being charged, while not decreasing financial aid reduce what's being charged, but that financial aid package was not adjusted even though the charges were lowered. You know, we don't take for granted that Penn was able to do that as one of the institutions in this country with resources. It still is, there's still a big price tag to it. But as you said, Jacques, as well, some schools just won't be able to weather that storm.
Thank you. And to further stretch the point, and I'd like to direct this to Dr. Fields. During our webinar series, Being Black in College, and it is designed for Black students and families who are navigating the college search process, we had many questions regarding campus culture, finding colleges that support and celebrate their Blackness, and how do we respond to student activism and how do we prepare students to be activists. So how can applicants learn this information about a college, and what standards should we hold colleges to when it comes to racial equity and justice? I know it's a very loaded question, so feel free to address it as you see fit.
So first of all, I do think that it's critically important to investigate whether or not an institution, you can glean that an institution walks the talk. It is not uncommon for any institution, academic or otherwise, to put out, you know, either the policy statements or the reaction statements when there are challenges on issues that occur in the community, when there are people that are very actively open about dissatisfaction with those issues, and then want to know how are you going to respond to that, and then and people need to and then do respond. So that is appropriate. That is the talk part. But then the walk part is now, what do you do systemically, structurally, organizationally, procedurally, that now reflects, if you will, the walk. And so you should look at how does the institution, in this case, the academic institution, how do they sit when it looks at where responsibility lies for addressing those types of issues? What leadership roles are responsible for overseeing these areas, and what do they have access to that report to the chancellor, to the provost, or to one of the key leadership roles? Are there centers that are engaged in in-depth study about these issues, and is their work translational? Because it's one thing to study an issue, it's another thing to, because of the results and the outcomes of the studies, to apply them. What are some policies? I went to a NASPA conference several years ago, where they talked about a concept of momentum, where there are some policies, sometimes maybe unintentionally, but that sometimes can impact the momentum of a student through their undergraduate experience. Some things can speed up the momentum, some things can slow it down, some things can stop it altogether. Does the institution recognize those types of policies, and then does it work to address those types of policies? Again, I have the privilege of working at Washington University in St. Louis, and so yes, I've seen us be so forward thinking in many of these types of areas. Something as simple as students being able to stay in the dorms during certain types of breaks, where normally they would just close the facilities and say everybody has to go, you know, home or go someplace. So that's one of the policies and things, for example, that got changed. Then finally, well, not finally, but some additional things to think about. What are some of the other strategic initiatives we've instituted where all of our students who meet certain financial need are going to get a certain stipend, if you will, or an allowance, I should say, for a computer, an allowance for certain types of other expenses. So yes, there are fees in the financial aid package that may cover books and those things, but we know that is greater than that. So there's an additional allowance for some of these other types of expenses. We have an Office for Student Success that has a Student Success Fund that now allows students to also come and get access to other things. So looking at those types of structures and systems and procedures, et cetera, strategic initiatives, communicates a lot, and the difficulty in finding them communicates a lot as well. So if they are somewhat prominently available to be found on websites, that tells you a lot about what they want you to know. And I guess the only other thing I'll say, I wanted to make sure that I talked about and the fact that we how do we report? There are certain demographics that every academic institution reports, but how do they report demographics, data, and can you now take that data and break it down and look at it demographically? In other words, yes, I know how we do institution-wide, but then I'm interested in a certain population. I want to know how women do in STEM. I want to know how Black and brown students do in these areas. And can you now look at that? Because that says a lot about the institution and transparency as well. So that last factor would be transparency. So those would be some off the top of my head comments about what to look for and how to find that information and data. And then the process of doing that tells you a lot about the institution.
Thank you very much for that robust explanation. The only thing I will add is, we are living in some very challenging times right now. And as a response to George Floyd's death and Tatiana Jefferson, and I can't go on and on, but we know the list is entirely too long, right? We have seen institutions, businesses, we've seen, nonprofits really speak up, and we've seen the NBA, and we've seen, organizations that have typically been a little bit more silent in these instances. We've seen them speak up now, but what I will add is that some can be riding the wave, right? Because it's what they're supposed to be saying and what they're supposed to be adding to the conversation. But I just want to stamp what Dr. Fields said about institutions, making sure structure is in place to support Black and brown students, because it is easy to say all these wonderful PC things, but the real work is in policy. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Fields. I will go back to the Q&A chat.
We'll just add to that question a little bit is, the profession that we work in, the board that Jacques served on in College Admission Counseling with the new leader, with Angel Perez as the head of the National Association. We shared a Zoom call with him not too long ago, which was wonderful. The piece that I just like to add is, and knowing all of the work that's taking place with Accept, is the younger professionals in our profession, because when we use the word culture and, the younger professionals, within our industry, I think are many of the individuals who will continue to push this and make sure that it's not just falling on the student voice. Students are there for 4 years and they have a lot invested in that experience, but also the young professionals in higher education and those seeking to come into this profession, I think will help carry that forward.
Thank you for that. I will just pause for a second and say we understand that the debate is airing in a few moments. And so if you need to log out to be a good citizen, we totally support that. Just know that our conversation will be on YouTube and you'll be able to access it at your convenience. So I'll go back to the Q&A chat. Yulia wants to know, how do we get the focus away from those U.S. news schools to the schools that support the majority of students in the country, those moderately selective publics? And I have a feeling Jacques would like to take a stab at this first.
Sure,
but,
and then others.
Anyone chime in.
And anyone can jump in, but we talk about at the outset of the book to the question, there are more than 2,000 four-year colleges in this country. And in some communities, you could forgive us for thinking there are 24 four-year colleges in this country, but more than 2,000, plus more than 2,000 community colleges. And we advocate early in the book, and look, the reader is going to have to decide whether they want to take our word for it or not, that there are fabulous experiences to be had at schools that don't necessarily rise to the top of the US News and World Report rankings. We don't advocate in the book that families spend a lot of time putting stock in those ratings, with one exception. I think the idea that like 4 colleges might be tied for 7th place on that rankings list, that doesn't strike me at least as particularly sound science, although I defer to Dr. Fields as the STEM representative of the panel. But that being said, if families look within those rankings, what are the data points that sort of added up to come up with that ranking? There may be interesting data in that. In addition, Eric has helped educate me about something called the Common Data Set, which is a whole other set of information about schools that is not in any way packaged as a ranking, but can provide valuable information on how to measure schools up against each other. And families can find common data set figures typically by Googling common data set and the name of an institution they're interested in. We also talk about the book Colleges That Change Lives, which makes the case for 4 dozen or so colleges and universities that many families may not have heard of. These are not schools that necessarily place high in the rankings, but they do place high in terms of student satisfaction and the student experience while they're there. And Eric's point about conclusions, what happens after students leave that institution. So we try to talk about a broad, open-minded approach, again, using some of the C's to generate lists that may be a little bit different than those that you see in something like US News. Eric, what have I missed in terms of rankings?
Well, really, it's as we feel that there's a great complement. There's data, the underlying data could be really powerful, and it's just trying to compact it to something that is, a list, which we all love as consumers sometimes. But given that we're talking about higher education, how could you actually compare some of these institutions? So the data is really helpful. Just be a research scientist, be a journalist, an investigative journalist, be skeptical and use it for yourself. I once wrote a piece for Huffington Post called Flip the List. It was rankings came out, it was from USA Today, and the University of Pennsylvania was #1. And so I said, okay, I have a platform here. I could either go out and say, hey, we're #1 in this one ranking, or use it as an opportunity to say, flip the list. And I'm not saying start from the bottom. It's just all across the spectrum, there's institutions that could be fantastic for you. And we also cite that we think that, the stat is somewhere around the average admit rate is 65, 66%. And so let's not just look at the right-hand side of the menu and say, if it's a really low admit rate, it's got to be good, right? Let's go think about it more critically.
If I may, I want to add one thing to that, and that is, and I thank you, Dr. Bennett, for putting the Colleges That Change Lives website in the chat. It reminded me that there's a parent who I work with their child and have their child on ACT, and they were looking for the right college for their child. And they shared with me that their child had a learning difference. I prefer that term, your learning difference. And so it just so happened that I had recently come from a conference at a college that specialized in the curriculum for learning differences in students. And I happened to mention this to that particular parent, and that parent got excited about that information because they were thinking about more of the traditional colleges that their child might go to, and they researched that one. They ended up sending their child to another college they found that had a similar a focus. It was in a different region of the country, but what helped it was they heard someone talk with them about the fact that there are colleges out there that have as part of their mission targeting students with learning differences, and that helped open up some gates for them in their thought processes. And then they introduced the idea to their daughter, and their daughter liked it, and like I said, went there and did quite well there. And so knowing that you want to think beyond the U.S. News and World Report means go to some of these other sites that are mentioned in the book and that you put into the chat, and learn about the other types, because again, there may be some special things you might want to consider for your child, or your child might want to consider for themselves, that might lead you to some additional gems of institutions that would be perfect for your student.
Thank you. I want to lift a question from Luxon. And all of you did allude to this earlier, but I just wanted to give it a moment here. Does the book speak specifically about first-gen low-income students and their college attainment process? So could you please expand on the points you made earlier about that?
Yeah, so we were very intentional. The book is called The College Conversation, and at one level, it's a conversation that Eric and I have been having professionally for more than a decade. But we didn't want this to just be a conversation between the two of us. It draws on all of the experience and expertise we've had in the various lenses and perspectives we've had on the process, but it's ultimately sort of narrow. And so one of the ways we expanded the conversation was to incorporate the voices of parents who had gone through this process with first-gen students for the first time. And the way we did that is we flew out to a school in San Diego called High Tech High. And it is a charter school that serves predominantly students from underrepresented backgrounds, including first-gen backgrounds. And we did a series of focus groups, investigative journalist style, that I sort of recruited Eric as a co-journalist, and we did interviews with families, and we asked them what would they want us to communicate through this book if they were trying to give advice for parents from a first-gen background going through this process for the first time. And Eric, sort of putting you on the spot in terms of, we learned many things that we were able to communicate in the book from those parents, but what were some of the things that resonated for you?
Well, a couple of the conversations when we went to San Diego, also when we went to the School for Advanced Studies in Miami and met with the principal there, Dr. Omar Montegudo, and just really the conversations that these educators, Chris White and the principal, facilitated with parent and child. And a lot of that was about geography and how far from home for what type of major, and the students saying, understanding where their parents were coming from. These are just wonderful, uplifting stories of, the true college conversation for individuals that college wasn't part of their lexicon, and building of trust, saying, you've done a great job raising me. Trust me to make this next step. Or as a parent saying, I really should not hold back my child. This is why I came to this country in the first place, so they can move further ahead in terms of their education and their careers. These are really touching stories at the very individual level, but you expand that out, across the nation. These are the conversations that need to take place. Now, that's not saying that staying close to home is the wrong decision for some students, maybe initially, but to at least have that conversation and not take something off the table prematurely, I think is really where, unfortunately, too many conversations ended before they even started.
So I said to the panelists before we went live that I'm trying to be cute and not wear my glasses, but it's just not working out, y'all. So I'm just gonna keep it going. I do want to lift a question from Lisa, and this is a good one. As a 30-year counselor, we push vulnerability, deep self-reflection, intentional college research, focus on fit over bragging rights. The real work required to find their alignment often pushes them to use the U.S. News and World Report out of exhaustion, which drives us crazy. Kids are busy and sleep deprived. Add in test prep when the world heals and most colleges go back to tests. How can we all do better? How can we take Professor Kendi's words from NACAC stating a campus can't be anti-racist and keep the most racist piece in admissions, and remove things like testing permanently to give students more time to focus on finding their alignment? Is this too Pollyanna?
I think it's a great question and framing, really. And I think there's really two parts to this, or there's multiple layers, as there always are. one of the pieces is that's been part of the language for a long period of time is, and families have ownership in this too, but as an admission dean, I take full responsibility of this. It's how far are we pushing children to try to become something, jumping through hoops to go to an institution? And I applaud, and I'm looking forward to going to the school side. In secondary schools that'll say, children will not take more than X number of advanced classes a year. That doesn't mean they're taking off or taking it easy or their curriculum isn't rigorous. It's recognizing truly developmentally where these young people are. And I see that through the lens of a fourth grader and a seventh grader in my own household, but then also through the secondary school side in my professional role. So Jacques mentions the stressed years of their lives, and a book that was written by a faculty member here at Penn, co-authored by a faculty member here at Penn. And I would say to parents, really, because at the end of the day, that's our responsibility as a parent, and everything else could be going on around us, is when is enough, and that you're going to try to meet your child where they are and really get to know your child. And as an admissions dean, or I'll be a former admissions dean at this point, I don't know if that's gonna make me a better parent or worse parent. I don't know. It's like, that's a different story. And well, I have to get your child, who's the clinical psychologist, Dr. Fields, to help me there. The other piece, and you know what, I'm going to be, and I know I'll get criticism for this, is we have to find a way, in an unbiased way, to assess student achievement, one, but really more importantly, student potential. And again, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or I'm not somebody that's making these tests diagnostically. At the end of the day, we will need some measures to help students, if nothing else, not use this as gatekeeper, as kind of being in that gatekeeper role, but just really helping diagnostically from the earliest ages, what growth looks like, what areas need to be addressed. And so how do you do that? How do you capture that in a way that A, is not biased, and B, can help any child developmentally not feel that they need to go through another hoop? And I'm sure many people have answers to that. I'm posing the questions. I'm not sure what the answers are. And then also, let's put this at the global scale, just what does competition look like globally, and where does, any nation fit within that? And just really maybe just completely changing the dynamic there and the structure.
I do want to pick up on one thread of the question related to the test optional movement. And this is an inflection point in higher education. It strikes me, and I'll be curious if Eric and Dr. Fields want to push back. But already pre-pandemic, there were hundreds of schools that had gone test optional or test blind in their admissions policies, and they're all listed on a website called fairtest.org, fairtest.org. When the pandemic hit, and it became virtually impossible at one point to take an SAT or an ACT without potentially putting yourself and your health at risk, so many institutions, including those of the Ivy League and the University of Pennsylvania, went test optional, at least temporarily. It'll be fascinating to watch what happens when the pandemic recedes. How many schools choose to try to put the genie back in the bottle? How many state university systems choose to put the genie back in the bottle, or say we're going to be test optional, or as Eric suggests, we're going to find a different way, a way that's more equitable, a way that's less biased, perhaps, a way that's fairer. And but the fact remains that if you are a high school senior on this call, or a parent of one, or a counselor of one, it's never been easier in this country than to apply without an SAT or an ACT to an institution of higher learning. Going forward, no matter how many schools sort of pull back on those policies, it will be possible to put together an outstanding college list, an excellent college list of institutions that don't require these exams. And so if your child wants to go through this process, we do encourage, when it becomes safe and healthy, to consider taking those exams, as long as there's no risk, to preserve your options. But if you as a child don't want to submit one of those exams, it's possible, will be possible going forward to do that. Dr. Fields, we haven't talked that much, in all the many conversations we've had over the years or for the book, your perspective on standardized testing and particularly standardized testing vis-a-vis issues of equity, measures against, as Eric talks about, the desire in a uniform way to try to measure potential.
So I'll talk about it from the perspective of when students enter the university. One of the things that when I say the university, I mean in general. I don't necessarily mean Washington University now. I mean university. We admissions groups look at students, and you make the point in the book about who are they competitive within the environment in which they are embedded, and so they come from the environment in which they are embedded, and then they go to this environment where there's this group of individuals that have cleared a certain, if you will, I'll call it a certain minimum hurdle that says that they are all at a certain level. But even within that level, we have to be aware that some students may have access to more courses. And yes, they should not take advanced courses for the sake of saying, I took so many advanced courses, but some students have more access to advanced courses than others. Some have taken more advanced courses than others. Sometimes a student went to a school where the maximum math that they took was trigonometry and algebra 2. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just simply what their school offered. And they still were at the top of their class. They got admitted to one of these academic institutions, one of these elite academic institutions. And now they go into a physics or a chemistry class where the majority of students have had, as I like to say sometimes when I give this example, calculus A, B, B, C, I, B, and X, Y, Z. So they have a different level of knowledge, a different level of skill, a different level of experience in terms of how to now go about problem solving. And then the student who may not have had that level of in-depth exposure to math, unfortunately compares themselves to that student and sees themselves as not, quote unquote, as capable. Sometimes they would use the word not as smart, when all it really means is they don't have the same basis of knowledge, experience, and skill. And what we have to be aware of is that as we now move, what I'm interested in is making sure that as we move through these processes of even whether test optional or not, is that we are aware that the on-ramps are different, and that we acknowledge that those on-ramps are different, and that we therefore realize that if we're going to have students who are interested in engineering and they have to start with STEM classes in the first year of an engineering curriculum, or they are, quote unquote, behind, right? That's the way it kind of looks in most institutions that I know about. If they're going to start there, then we have to say, how do we help this student navigate the curriculum so that the fact that they had trig and algebra 2, but they got to start out and finish calc 3 by the end of their freshman year, how do we help them now navigate this? Can we do so by changing curriculum? Can we do so by a different pathways for them? Or can we do so by providing different kinds of support? But we have to be aware of those things. And sometimes the standardized test, from my perspective, can also help the student know where they stand in terms of the discipline, the knowledge, the experience, the skills of applying where they already are to now college level type learning. And it doesn't mean they can't do it, it just means it lets them know where they are, gives them an assessment. And that can be very handy when you take that as just that. It's just a snapshot of where you are in time. And now you can say, now knowing what I know about myself, I now know what things I can now leverage or take advantage of to make sure that it does not become anything other than an asset along the way, as opposed to an impedance along the way. So that may not be the answer you were searching for, but I try to, again, look at them on the positive side and say, let's make sure that the institution owns, we admitted them, so let's help them achieve what they want to achieve. And let's be aware that there are some structural differences that can impact that, but also for the students to learn, this is just a data set, it's just one point in time. And it may be diagnostic, and but it's not definitive and deterministic. It doesn't predict what it is that I can do and where I'll go. So that's my response to you, Jacques.
You know, one of the pieces here too, I think, and this is still going up from this question, is scalability. And I think that, you know, particularly standardized testing, let's put it completely to the side. If in this country we could make sure that there is a level of challenge and rigor in, again, K through 12 education, we could really focus this maybe from middle school into high school, as so many programs will try to enter in those middle school years. When the University of Pennsylvania worked with the Posse Foundation in Miami, I mentioned the School for Advanced Studies before, you know, the public schools within Miami had a strong basis of rigorous curriculum, largely because of relationships with Miami-Dade College. And to take that, knowing that there was a level of rigor there, and this is where scalability comes in, was then through the Posse Foundation, going down and interviewing students in a dynamic assessment process, their DAP process. Boy, that's the best. It's like the heck with 40,000 applications. I'd rather have 2,400 applications the size of our class, maybe 5,000, and then meet these students, see them interact with each other. That's community, you know, in the 4 C's. But knowing that they had challenging curriculum in secondary school, and these students succeed so far beyond what standardized testing measures would say and their socioeconomic backgrounds would suggest as well. So scalability.
I really appreciate all those comments. I'll add, from my professional experience, I've worked in both low income and affluent communities. And for those on the call who may not be as familiar with this work, typically during the fall and late spring, depending on the deadlines, college counselors can schedule calls with college representatives or recruiters to talk through the admissions decisions, right? And I was on the phone with a particularly selective institution, and I was, you know, just having a conversation about a few students and why they were admitted, why some weren't. And for the students who weren't admitted, it was because those students didn't take the rigorous courses that other students did take. And so now when I'm on this side and I'm working with students from underrepresented communities, fortunately, KIPP does offer AP for all, and so that isn't necessarily a challenge on our end. But what about students who don't have access to those AP courses and that test prep and robust college counseling services? So the playing field is definitely far from level, but I'm just grateful that these conversations and policy are happening so we can do better for our students in the future.
And the KIPP students at the University of Pennsylvania have done so well. We've had a relationship with KIPP for a number of years now. And that also gets into what Dr. Fields, the role that he plays at a college, at a university level, and that's mentorship as well. Connecting students in very early on with strong mentors and support. And so it's a combination of all these factors.
Thank you. So we're just a few minutes away from our time. I just wanted to give all of you an opportunity to just share some last minute thoughts with our families who are on the call and for those who will watch it at a later time. So would you like to get us started, Jacques?
Sure. First of all, I will acknowledge again, as a parent who's gone through this twice, we've thrown so much information at you tonight, those of you who are parents or students on the call, just to as soon as this Zoom call is over, a collective exhale. I'm not sure if watching the vice presidential debate is going to be the least stressful thing you can do, but something that just provides something of a pause. But it's a lot to process. I think you've seen that, like Dr. Bennett, Dr. Fields, Eric, and I are very much glass half full or more folks. We're optimists. And I want to leave you with the message. And again, I've used that Pollyanna-ish framing before, and I'm going to use it one more time. I hope you won't find it Pollyanna-ish to say, this is doable. This is manageable, a good outcome, an affordable opportunity, options that constitute fit. All these things are possible. and they require work, they require intentionality, they require due diligence and digging and teamwork. But the outcome is possible and attainable. I'm sure this must seem so daunting. If you keep an open mind, if you're persistent, if you pace yourself, if you take breaks, if you avail yourself of resources like college counselors, like Dr. Bennett, and there are outstanding college counselors in institutions across the country, an outcome that is favorable is possible.
Eric?
Yeah, I'd like to give Dr. Fields the last word here. So, you know, writing a book with Jacques was such a journey, and I want to thank him for charting the course. And I'd like to thank Accept for hosting us this evening. You know, one of the real pieces here is you write a book or you have a radio show, and you're never quite sure there's anyone out there. And so thank you for reading the book. I mean, seriously, you know, we don't take for granted that individuals are going to read this. And when you do, and you say things about it, it's like it's really an honor that you actually read the book and that you had some takeaways that you feel will help families. So, you know, just as educators, if we could share our little piece of knowledge, and we'll all continue to grow and learn together and hope for greater things for the young people of this country and around the world. I mean, that's really what we're trying to do, is help families.
Well, I am again humbled again to be a part of this conversation in terms of contributing to the book, as well as just to be a part of this conversation with all of you, particularly thanks again to Jacques and Eric. And if I was going to end, I'd end with something that is so important to me that I see it frequently. And there's two things. The one thing is, these are critical. This is a critical process because you cannot underestimate and you cannot overstate the power of a high quality education and its impact on the life of the student. And high quality, I don't necessarily mean like by selectivity of institution. I mean by the student being where they want to be, need to be, and engaging in the curriculum that they want to follow, and then graduating with that degree. It's important to me. That's why I emphasize in the bio that I shared that I'm a first-gen, low-income, Trail-eligible student. You know, my mom did ultimately go back and get a GED, and then ultimately did get a college degree, et cetera, in nursing, et cetera. But at the time in which I was growing up, that wasn't the case. Single parent raising children, and so in just 2 generations, I guess, unless I'm counting generations wrong, well, maybe 3. My mom, me, and then my children went from not having a college degree, raising kids, to now having all of one's biological kids having a terminal degree in their respective areas, right? That's the power of a high quality education. And so the first thing I would say, that's why these conversations are so important and so never underestimated. But then the second thing I would say, and I will end with this, is just, so trust the process and trust yourselves in the process. I remember having a parent come to me who knew nothing about college, and they were concerned about, they wanted me to be a mentor to their kid because they knew nothing about college. And I told them I'd be more than willing to be a mentor to the kid, but only if they were willing to understand that they also needed to be engaged in the process, because it didn't need to be a handoff. They know enough from their life experience. Their kid was only at my doorstep because of their life experience and their choices as a parent, right? And so I tell everybody out there, trust the process, but also trust yourself in the process, and then have that great college conversation, and the outcomes can be simply transformative. That's what I would end with.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. The only thing I will add, and I did include it in the chat, but if you happen to attend a high school, or if you are the parent of a student who attends a high school that does not offer robust college counseling, and we know all college counseling departments aren't equal because a lot of schools are under-resourced. And so if that is the case, please look into community-based organizations in your area, because there are highly qualified folks who are willing to help you and your students get to that next level. So I just have to say on behalf of Accept, I am really grateful for our panelists, Eric, Harvey, Jacques. You all are amazing. You offered some great wisdom and guidance for our attendees today. And so we are in your debt. Thank you so much. For those who are still with us, I understand you might be trying to avoid the debate, but you are free to go and catch the second half of it. This will be available on YouTube tomorrow. And so Marie will email all of you who have registered for this panel, and you'll be able to access all of the resources in the chat as well as the broadcast on YouTube. So thank you very much. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Wear your mask, stay safe. Thank you again, and we'll be back at it next week. Y'all have a fantastic evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Marie.
That was so great. Thanks, gentlemen, so much. I will send you the link.
I see Lloyd Thacker was in there because the mastery transcript is coming up.
Jenny Byers was with us.
I saw Myrony Simpson.
Yes. Harvey, Jenny Byers is another WashU alum, 2 degrees, worked in the admissions office for a long time, and is now one of the most respected college counselors out there.
Excellent. I'll have to connect with them.
Absolutely. We're everywhere.
Yes.
Are we still live?
We are still live. So I always like this part, and I wish there was a way to turn this off, but I think that everyone should see our good nights to each other.
Yeah. Well,
thanks, everyone.
Thank
you,
so
Marie. Really, really grateful. And Harvey,
That was wonderful.
God, you just wonderful.
Well, Jacques, you're very gracious, and Eric, again, amazing. So thank y'all very much. Again, I was just honored to be here. Maybe you might have gave me some points in my wife's eyes. We'll have this.
Yay. Gentlemen, I will send you emails with links and information tomorrow. Good night.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.